Hello everyone. Shori here. This is going to be a little bit of a different video. This video is mainly going to be about finding out which mid lane champion you should be playing. Because there are so many different mid lane champions, and I make tier lists, and there are a lot of tier lists available out there. But at the end of the day, tier lists are quite subjective when it comes to actually being able to perform in solo queue. Usually, what I recommend to people is don't pay too much attention to tier lists. Pick champions that you mesh very well with. Everyone is subjective. That is what I tell people. Very important to understand this. Every person has a style that they click more with in terms of champions, right? So some players really click with like lane bully champions. Some players really click with control mage champions. So I'm going to be trying to break down all the archetypes of champions here that I think fit well together. So if you enjoy playing control mages, I'm going to give you the general control mages that you can branch out into, right? So you only have one control mage champion at the moment, but you want to add another one. I'm going to give my recommendations, right? Disclaimer before we get into the actual tier list, or well, I guess it's not a tier list. Disclaimer before we get into the actual list. Again, very subjective things, right? Play whatever you find fun, but this would be my recommendation, and this is my suggestion for something to consider. Also, let me know if I miss out on anyone or if I mischaracterize a champion or anything like that. Leave it in the comment. I'm super open to discussion in that regard. Also, some champions will fall into multiple categories. Of course, you have champions like Ahri. You could consider Ahri a diver. You could consider her an assassin. You could consider her a push and roam champion. I'm going to put her into one category. Understand, these champions can go in multiple different categories. Mid lane champions are very broad in terms of how they can play the game, right? Because at the end of the day, all you need to be is you need to either be able to wave clear or kill the enemy champion. It's all you need to be a mid laner. That's literally all you need. So you can play a lot of different styles in mid lane, which is why I think it's a super cool role, right? Also, if you haven't already, please do subscribe to the channel. It helps me out a bunch. I release videos like these all the time. And also check out the Patreon and add me on Discord if you want coaching. But yeah, let's get into it, shall we? First of all, we have your traditional control mages. The champions I have here, Syndra, Orianna, Victor, Veigar, and Brand. All of these champions kind of try to accomplish the same thing in the game, in that they don't really move that much on the map during the laning phase. They play very much for their own laning phase. They all have CC or setup to help with ganks, and they all control a bunch of space in team fights. These champions are for when you really enjoy playing laning phase in an interactive manner, but you also really want to have a lot of team fighting prowess. You want a lot of AoE spells, and you want to be able to control fights very easily. These champions all have different strengths, right? So Syndra, for example, Syndra is extremely good after she hits level 7. She's good at neutralizing laning phases, and she's good at completely 1v9ing fights. She has a lot of burst as opposed to other champions here, right? She has a lot of single target damage, and she has a lot of different versatile builds, which is why she's very high up in the tier list, generally speaking, at the moment. Orianna, same thing. Orianna can play different styles. She has a lot of nice wave clear. She clears the wave very early, low cooldowns, very easy for her to one-shot stuff, and she has a bunch of AoE damage in fights, right? I recommend these two champions as general control mages if you just like playing the archetype. I think they're the most true fitting control mages, I suppose, especially at the moment. I highly recommend Orianna. That's my queen of mid lane, of course. Now, if you want to have a little bit of a stronger laning phase, but you don't want as much AoE in team fights, for example, all of Orianna's spells are basically AoE, all of Syndra's spells are AoE, I'd recommend Victor. Victor sacrifices some of that team fighting AoE ability to be able to play in a more ranged manner and have a stronger laning phase. Victor's laning phase is incredibly strong. It is hard for him to lose against almost any champion, right? He beats them because of his Q being so obnoxious for trades. So if you want to have a little bit of a weaker team fighting phase, a little bit of less setup, a little bit of less AoE damage in fights, but you want to have a longer or a stronger side lane threat because Victor is stronger in 1v1s, and a stronger laning phase, you can opt into something like a Victor. Say you just want to farm and do nothing for the first 20 minutes of the game, basically. We have Veigar. Veigar, super obnoxious champion, especially if you enjoy playing something like an Everfrost on him. Putting down the Veigar cage and then Everfrosting someone in the middle and guaranteeing that WQ hit, absolutely fantastic. Also, Veigar's pretty hard for people to deal with. You could consider Veigar an anti-dive champion as well if you really want to, but I'm gonna put him up in control mage because I think he controls a lot of space in fights, and it's a lot of fun stacking infinitely. That's always fun for dopamine. And it's fun hitting an ult on the enemy squishies and one-shotting them, right? Brand, you might be a little bit shocked to see this guy here. I think he deserves a spot in general control majors. People are starting to realize that Brand is broken. Thank God I've been trying to tell everyone for the past like 4 or 5 months and trying to get pro players to play him. People are finally starting to pick him up in mid lane. I feel like I've gone insane trying to convince people to play him. This guy is basically like a tank shredder, but he has AoE. So think Cassiopeia, but he has AoE as well, which Cassiopeia usually lacks, right? He can build Rylai's first item, which makes him very, very strong and tanky against assassins, which means that usually control mages at the lower end, they kind of struggle against assassins. Brand doesn't. You pick up a Rylai's. Good luck one-shotting that guy now. You can't. So I'd recommend Brand. He's probably one of the highest recommendations I have for the lower end of the ladder. In terms of poke mages, these champions are generally speaking very, very good against mid-range team compositions because they can outrange them, you can slowly whittle down the enemy champions, and they usually scale very, very well. Range is absolute key in League of Legends. It allows you to whittle down enemy champions and find one-shots from range, right? They play lane, generally speaking, in a very non-interactive way in that they usually just focus on one-shotting waves and then either poking the enemy on their tower or just waiting and doing nothing, right? Once they get their 2-item spike, usually these champions are very, very strong. Let's start off. Xerath. Xerath, kind of one of the better scaling poke mages in the game. 4 skill shots, a lot of ults. If you like landing skill shots and if you're good at hitting skill shots, absolutely play this champion. I, for one, am terrible at landing skill shots. I can never hit any of them, so I'm not touching any of these champions usually. I suck at skill shots, so I will not be touching Xerath, which is why I play Ziggs. Ziggs is an easier version of Xerath. He functions more as an anti-dive as well due to his E, but his skill shots are so easy to hit because they're so absolutely massive, right? You can't miss a Ziggs ult, and they usually function with setup on your team as well. Say you want a poke mage that scales well and is strong in lane. Vel'Koz. That champion can usually bully a lot of control mages in lane, just due to how his passive works and how his Q works, and he has quite low cooldowns, right? Now, maybe you like having a shield instead of speccing into all of your damage. Lux is a good champion then. You can have a fat AoE shield once you get to the later stages, and usually hitting that E is not that big of a problem, right? Because that E is huge, so you can usually harass the enemy laner quite a lot, which is nice. Lux is good for that reason. It's very hard to dodge her E, and she can also play very non-interactively by just ulting the wave every time possible, right? Now, Corki, you might be like, well, Corki isn't a mage, Espen. Are you smoking crack? And I will tell you, these champions, Corki and Jace, I consider mages, poke mages in that regard, because they play in a very similar manner. They might not build AP necessarily, but they play in a very similar manner to poke mages in that they just blast skill shots off and play as a poke champion. Corki can also play as a different DPS champion if he goes AD build. I will not talk about that. Corki, very, very nice if you want to just play for 3 items and land huge rockets. Probably one of my favorite poke mages to play. You just play lane in a very non-interactive manner, you get your package, you have a massive team fighting threat, and you can poke with those ults. And you just need to hit one big one, and you're one-shotting the enemy backline. I really enjoy that. Jace shifts a little bit more strength into the laning phase because he obviously can play AD. He's not quite as good as some of the other strong laning champions, but once you hit your Serrated Dirk and you get level 5, level 7, usually you can have quite a lot of pressure in the lane. And also if you need an AD mid laner, Jace is great. Zoe, champion is kind of bad right now, but if you do enjoy one-shotting squishies that just generally speaking being very annoying to play against, I would highly recommend Zoe as well. Kog'Maw, probably the best scaling poke mage in the game, just due to how low cooldown his ult gets, how much damage it does, and the absurd range it has. It is an obnoxious range you get on the Kog'Maw ult at level 16. It is stupid. Probably about as good scaling as Xerath does, which is insane, right? Because Xerath is one of the best scaling mages in the game. Max E on Kog'Maw, focus on blasting the waves, and that's all you need. Make sure you get a Rylai so you can consistently land those ults. That's what you want to do. Or maybe the enemy team is picking champions that all dive in. Maybe they're picking champions where you're like, oh, damn, they always pick assassins in solo queue, in which case you need to play anti-dive champions. So let's go over some of them, shall we? Compositionally and archetypally, if that's a word, there are a lot of different anti-dive champions, as you can see of the lineup here. I am tempted to put Cassiopeia in a hyper carry tier, but I think traditionally speaking, she just considers herself more of an anti-dive champion. She excels when people have to come into her, right? But you could also consider her as a hyper carry. But Cassiopeia, probably one of the best champions in the game to 1v9. She just has such an absurd amount of damage. If you can get through the laning phase, and if you're competent at her, if you're strong mechanically, and you just love playing against champions that come into you, I would highly recommend Cassiopeia. Talia, she shifts more of her strength into being a setup anti-dive champion, in that she CCs people when they come into her as well, and she has a lot of AoE damage, unlike Cassiopeia, who has mostly single target damage. And Talia also works very, very well with setup junglers, because you can just CC lock someone to death. So that's when I'd recommend Talia. Also, she can roam quite well as opposed to some of these other champions. These champions are, by the way, mainly for if you like playing against champions that dive into you. You need to have one of these champions in your repertoire, usually. Anivia, very unique champion, which is good. Means not a lot of people know how to play against her. She's very frustrating to play against if you don't know what to do, because she will just blow up the wave, and if you try to contest her, she will blow up you. And if she blows up the wave, what is she gonna do? She's gonna roam out onto the map, and now she's a lane threat. And she has a lot of burst in the laning phase as well if people are not ready and if they can't dodge your Q. I'd highly recommend you trying her if you enjoy the style of like one-shotting the wave and playing more non-interactively and then scaling very well. She's perfect for that style. Vex, she can play as an assassin and an anti-dive champion, so if you enjoy those two archetypes put together, definitely try out Vex. She has a very strong laning phase and does very, very well into assassins or just champions with mobility in general due to her passive. Absolutely try her out if you enjoy those champions. Lissandra, kind of similar to Vex. She's more of a setup version of Vex, I count her as. She can engage as well, which is very nice. She can go into more of a burst mage build as well with something like a Ludens and go for one-shots. But generally speaking, she's just considered good against assassins, because if someone dives in against Alessandra, what is she going to do? She's going to go Entomb! And what are you going to do now as said? You're just stunned there for 3 seconds because she's going to press W on you afterwards. And you're probably dead. Kennen, very good against team compositions that dive in, because he can just land a massive ult, and he can also dive, which is nice. Ryze, generally speaking, good against shorter range champions that dive in as well. Very, very high DPS. Very difficult to play as well, so unless you really click with his style, I would not recommend trying him. But, you know, why not give it a shot and see what happens? Maybe he works for you. I would not recommend him to most players, though. He's very hard to play, and he has a lot of things that he needs to do. He has a very strong laning phase. If you are against a good matchup, against control mages, though, he can be very difficult to navigate. And it's pretty hard to kite properly on him as well in team fights. Swain, anti-dive in the way that he is very good against burst champions, because, well, they can't really one-shot him. So he's going to take maybe 50% of his health, and then he's going to heal everything up with ult, and he has very good setup as well. He's more of a drain tank in that regard, which makes him good against assassins as well, because they can't one-shot him, which means he's going to kill them. If you can't one-shot the Swain, or if you can't burn down his health bar with DPS, he wins. So he's good against those types of champions. Now maybe you are a 14-year-old kid that cranks 90s on Fortnite, and you have the hands of Messiah and Jesus put together, and you just have the best mechanics known to mankind. Well, then maybe you want to play an assassin, because they give you a lot of dopamine, because they're super fun to play, and they have very, very high skill ceilings. I know I'm not that good of them, because look at these old decrepit hands, man. They can't keep up with something like a Zed or an Akali. They're too slow for that, so I can't play them, but maybe you can, in which case let's go over Assassin. Now, I have divided up the tiers between Assassins and Divers. I think some champions are more committal than others, and I think some champions are meant to one-shot others, and ones are meant to dive in and prolong a fight or something like that, right? So they will be divided up. They are very, very similar in how they play fights, though, but I think Assassins are just a little bit more focused on blowing up one target, whereas Divers are more like AoE, play longer fights and distract the enemy backline, so that's why I've divided them up, right? But Zed, very, very good for lower MMRs. He's very frustrating to play against, is what a lot of people have told me. He's probably one of the top 3 champions I hear when people ask me for a guide on how to play against these champions. The other two being Yone and Akali, which I'm probably going to make guides on, right? Zed functions very similarly to a poke champion in the laning phase, which sounds very strange, right? But that is because his W-E-Q combo, and just generally speaking his Q combo, he is less committal than other assassins on this list. You don't have to go in on Zed in lane. You don't have to trade like a psychopath in the lane, which you do with these champions. You can just sit back and poke the enemy laner until they're in one-shot range, and then you can kill them, right? Which makes him very frustrating to play against. I'd highly recommend picking him up if you don't want to play these other assassins, but you still need to add an assassin to your champion pool. He is not as committal as these champions, right? Which leads me to Fizz. This champion has to play like a psychopath, you have to fist fight, and you have to kill the enemy laner at level 6. The beautiful part about Fizz is, you can almost one-shot any champion in the game at level 6, level 7 if you hit your ult on them. It does not matter that you've fallen down 20 CS and gotten solo killed twice, you can almost still one-shot anyone. This champion allows you to play like an absolute psycho during the laning phase, because you can just jump on the enemy laner, almost one-shot them, and then just E away and backflip out of there, woo! And the enemy laner can't trade with you at all, right? Like, you just slowly whittle them down that way. He is a little bit annoying because it's hard to solo carry a game on Fizz because he's mostly single target, which means you can't really carry team fights as hard. Like, you can one-shot the enemy AD carry, but then, like, your AD carry might just run over an int as well. So that's kind of a problem I found on him. He can't 1v9 games that hard, but you can usually kill the enemy laner and then snowball very heavily because you deal such an absurd amount of damage. So it is on you, if you kill the enemy laner, to explode out onto the map and carry the game through killing the enemy bot lane or enemy jungler on repeat. Katarina, probably one of the best champions for 1v9ing. If she gets ahead, she will just 1v5 a fight, just like that. She has the potential to like solo carry an entire game by blowing up the entire enemy team. If you enjoy a champion that is very difficult mechanically, like you need like 800 APM on this champion like Hackermans to be able to make this work. I can tell you I cannot play this champion. My fingers are like beep boop beep boop. Doesn't work for me. I can't do that. But if you do enjoy Katarina and if you do have very fast hands or you just have played her a lot, highly recommend her. She's very unique in the way that she plays though. She requires you to invest a lot of games to get used to her. If you just want to pick up an assassin for your champion pool, I would not recommend her. But if you want to invest a bunch of games into an assassin that can potentially 1v9 every single game that you get into in solo queue, highly recommend Katarina. But she's very specialized and very unique in the way that she plays. Probably the best carry potential out of any of these assassins when it comes to solo queue though. Nefari, probably the easiest out of all of these assassins to play. Mostly because, well, she's not that reliant on actually winning the laning phase or doing anything special. She scales very well. You can literally just double blast someone with a Q and call it a day. The only thing you really have to learn is her dogs, how they really function, and how you need to use your E to heal them, but that is about it. Outside of that, hit your Q on the enemy laner, call it a day. You can afford to fall behind in the laning phase because you scale very well. Recommend her very heavily for lower elo players that want an assassin, or want an AD mid laner in general. She's very good for 1v9 in games at the lower end of the ladder. Pyke, very unique again as a champion. Go watch Dave Mon if you want to see why you should be playing Pyke. That guy drops 30 kills in Challenger consistently. This champion is bonkers if you know how to play him, but not a lot of people know how to play him. You probably need to invest like 500, 600 games on him. So I'd not, generally speaking, recommend him as an assassin, mostly because the way he plays is he plays very non-traditionally in that he drops a lot of CS to try to get kills on the map, and he feeds on chaos. But if you enjoy his style, or if you're used to playing him from support, absolutely pick him up in the mid lane and go play like a roaming style. It works very well. LeBlanc. LeBlanc can also be categorized as a different style of champion, maybe closer to something like an engage or a poke champion if you really want to, or a dive champion or a poke champion, sorry. But I'm going to classify her as an assassin because I think truly she is trying to one-shot one target. She plays in a very non-committal way as well, just like the Zed, in that she can just jump in and then jump back out, call it a day, right? You don't have to commit to anything, so you look for one-shots and then that's that. She is also very annoying to play against in the laning phase, especially at the low end of the ladder, because people don't know how to punish her cooldowns very well. I would highly recommend this champion, especially if you enjoy the possibility of being able to play different styles on an assassin. LeBlanc can shift into a Liandry's build, where she becomes more of a poke champion. She can shift into maybe a static Shiv build, where she becomes more of a split push threat. So I enjoy her a lot as one of my main assassin champions. She also has great setup with her chain. Qiyana, 1v9 champ, Snowball. If you're Beifwang Chinese combo, whatever you call him, I don't really watch him that much, but if you can make combos like that happen, play this champion. You can absolutely 1v9 games. She's also getting buffed on this patch, so looks pretty good to me. I think there are better AD assassin options. I, generally speaking, would just prefer something like a Nefari, mostly because, well, Qiyana, like, she's kind of weak when it comes to actually like playing the laning phase. She kind of sucks. She's very weak in lane, and she has to get kills on her roams. But if she gets kills on her roams, she's very strong. She's very reliant on snowballing as opposed to some of these other assassins, though, which I don't like as much. Next, let's move on to the diving tier. Maybe you enjoy just jumping into the entire enemy team and fist fighting the enemy team to death, instead of maybe one-shotting a specific target and then kind of jumping out of the fight and saying, I've done my job, I one-shot the enemy AD carry. If my team loses, that's on them now, right? Maybe you enjoy actually just trying to 1v5 the game by 1v5ing fights and just jumping in and trying to kill everyone. In that case, divers are for you. So, these champions usually can be played in a very assassin-y style. Some of them can. They have a lot of upfront damage that can one-shot targets, but they have short enough cooldown to not consider them like traditional assassins. They have short enough cooldowns that they can get multiple rotations off in fights and actually kill multiple targets, which is usually the weakness of an assassin, right? So, Akali, this champion, probably the most prolific champion in the game when it comes to watching something like a World. She's always played and she always looks bonkers, right? Because of her ult and her insane mobility. She's very difficult to maneuver in fights. You need to learn how to use her shroud properly. You need to navigate fights very well on her, use your ult correctly and your E correctly. But if you want to pick up Akali, what I'd recommend is go into Practice Tool, learn her Alt-E combo so you can consistently land it, and then also figure out how to play the laning phase on her, because you have to get to your one item before you're really a threat. But this champion is very frustrating to play against at the low end of the ladder because people do not know how to punish her properly in laning phase, and they usually get one-shot by her in laning phase as well, even though that's where she's supposed to be weak. Sylas, more of a upfront fighter than something like an Akali. Akali kind of, pun intended, goes into the shroud and then one-shots you. Sylas, he will just jump into your face, chain you up, and call it a day, right? Beat you up. So, if you enjoy that kind of style, if you enjoy a lot of skirmishing power, which Sylas definitely probably is the mid laner that has the most of, then absolutely pick up this champion. He's also very fun because when you get ahead, you absolutely one-shot everyone. And if you like stealing ults, this champion's pretty fun as well. You can play different champions while you're playing your Sylas, which is cool. Yone, you might be a little bit shocked to see him on diving list, but I don't really know where else to put him. Mostly because Yone can play different styles, but I would consider him mostly a diver because his intention is jump in and try to kill as many people as possible. Not so much jump in and try to one-shot one target, right? So Yone, very frustrating to play against. The brother of Yasuo, obviously. Very, very cool to play because you just stack up triple Q and then you jump on the enemy laner and call it a day. He can also be a very big menace in the side lane, so I would highly recommend playing him because people don't know how to play against him. And he's a lot of fun, probably one of my favorite champions in the game. Yasuo, again, if your hands have been blessed by the heavens, pick up this champion. He's absolutely broken. Now, usually you only want to pick him when you have knockups on your team, but he's absolutely broken and it's very strong in lane, very strong in team fights. Just make sure you don't go 0-10 on him, yeah? Tryndamere, very good champion for lower MMRs. He's very frustrating to play against, and you can do a lot of diving. He can 1v9 games by split pushing as well. A lot of different styles. I like him a lot. Pantheon. Pantheon is one of those champions that plays through, like, carries through roaming and then dives in and acts more of a frontline in fights that has a damage threat. If you enjoy playing a champion that goes from being very, very strong damage threat early in the laning phase, having a lot of kill threat and being able to one-shot enemy targets, and then transitions more into like a get priority in lane and roam out onto the map during the mid game of the laning phase, and then at the end game he transitions more into a frontline engaged champion that just buys a lot of time but still has kill threat on the enemy carries. I'd highly recommend something like a Pantheon, right? I wouldn't consider him an assassin because he transitions more into a bruisery type with stuff like Shojin and Black Cleaver. Same as something like a Renekton, except Renekton is a little bit stronger in the lane than Pantheon and transitions more into a bruisery champion, I think. Renekton also has a few worse matchups in the lane, but Renekton is a lot better against champions like Sylas than Pantheon, I think. Cassante, nerf this champion, right? Please. Tank and one-shot? How is he allowed to have that, bro? Nerf it, please. Now, maybe you want to engage fights because your jungler or your top laner decided to pick a carry champion, and now I have a Kindred jungle, and maybe something like an Akali or Gwen top lane. We have no way of engaging. Well, then you should pick an engaged champion mid lane. Maybe you enjoy playing tanks, and then maybe you want to start fights for your teammates because you don't trust them to do it properly yourself. Well, then you should be playing engagers, right? Now, as you can tell from this selection of champions, there are two different styles of engagers. There's the mage engaged champion that has a bunch of upfront damage, but still their main job in the game is just landing that massive engage and one-shotting everyone on the enemy team. And then there are the tanks, right? So let's go over the mages first. Annie and Nico. I think Annie, great champion if you want to just learn how to play the fundamental aspects of mid lane, and if you want to learn how to actually look for fights during the mid game by flash ulting or something like that, or learn how to look for angles of how to approach fights by covering vision or deleting vision and sitting and trapping in bushes. And she's very simple to play, especially during the laning phase. She's great at teaching you the fundamental aspects of laning. Highly recommend her if you want to play an engaged champion but also want to learn the basics of mid lane. Highly recommend her in that regard. Neeko, probably the step up from Annie in terms of difficulty, a much stronger laning phase than something like an Annie because of her Q poke and her absurd 3-second snare on E if you manage to hit that on the enemy laner, or maybe it's 2.5. Ridiculous. It feels like I'm spending the entire game being snared, like my mortgage is fully paid off by the time that I'm out of that snare, and I even have tenacity boots. Like, how is that possible, right? But her ult, absolutely massive, right? If you really want to find those big 5-man ults and big engagers and just 1v9 the game like that, Neeko is the champion for you. And she also has a lot of trickery with her passive, which is very fun to play around with, especially at the low end of the ladder. If you want to turn into a minion, people usually don't count enough minions on the wave, and then boom, you've one-shot the enemy AD carry. I very much so enjoy playing Neeko. She's very fun. Now we move into more of the tanky, supportive aspect of engaged champions, where you find champions like Galio. I don't usually recommend Galio, but if you enjoy roaming a lot, carrying the game through roaming and not so much dealing damage, and starting good fights, then I'd highly recommend something like a Galio. He plays very non-interactively in the lane. You just push waves and try to roam out onto the map, and then during the mid game, you turn into more of an engagey champion, right? Ornn as well. I used to use Ornn as a counter pick against tanks being played in the mid lane, so when Sion was meta mid lane, or when Galio was meta mid lane, I'd play a lot of Ornn, which leads me to believe there probably should be a Sion somewhere here, but I digress. Ornn, a lot of fun if you know how to do the Ornn combo. He's not, generally speaking, recommended that much in the mid lane right now, but if you enjoy Ornn, he can absolutely be played mid lane. Very good at dealing with melee tanks, or just melee bruisers in general. I think he's very good against champions like Pantheon as well. If you want to find a counter pick against him, then Ornn is highly recommended. And it's obviously fun just calling the Ornn horn and being like, and then blasting the enemy team, right? Malphite, very good against AD assassins. So against something like a Zed, a Nefari, or a Talon, or a Pyke, or a Kiana, I usually pick Malphite. I go Comet, I go Doran's Ring, and then I blast the enemy laner, and then I scale into an absolute menace. Pick this guy against the enemy team if they have around 3 AD threats, and one of them is in the mid lane. I'd highly recommend this champion then. He can 1v9 games just by being Malphite. Nautilus turns into a roaming champion, very similar to Galio. You shove out the wave, and then you roam, and then you start good fights during the mid game. He plays very similar to something like a Galio. So if you enjoy Galio, but you want to add another champion to your list, I'd highly recommend something like a Nautilus. Next, these champions are more so for if you have a duo queue or you have a very strong jungler that you want to try to help carry the game. They usually shift a lot of attention away from themselves. They have strong laning phases because they have insane base damage, but they usually end up leaning on their teammates to carry, which is very nice if you have a very strong jungler or if you're duo queuing with a jungler that plays carry champions. Otherwise, don't pick these champions if you are trying to 1v9 the game on your own, because they can't. Yeah, as you can see, the nature of these champions are very much like healing and shielding. They all have pretty good laning phases, except for Seraphine. She's kind of weaker in the laning phase, but Seraphine scales very well. Karma, Ivern, Soraka, Cillian all have quite strong laning phase. Actually, Cillian doesn't have that good of a laning phase. Karma, insanely strong laning phase due to her Q and her Mantra Q. She scales into more of a supportive champion because of her ult E. If you're playing with something like a Xin Zhao jungle, Kindred jungle, Viego jungle, Graves jungle, any of those types of champions, then this champion is very strong. Same goes for Ivern, insanely strong laning phase, especially with his Daisy. At level 6, you just pop Daisy, you press E on her, you right-click the enemy champion with Daisy, and then you get free lane priority. So if you want to roam or play with your jungler or get a dragon, Ivern is super good for that. He's very good with champions like Rengar, Viego, Xin Zhao, mostly melee bruisery champions because Ivern loves champions that go in and dive because that gets him the opportunity to proc his E on them and his E damage goes off on the enemy team. Highly recommend Ivern if you enjoy supportive champions that are extremely strong in the laning phase. I've practiced this champion a bunch. You might think it looks troll, but I promise you he has such an absurd laning phase due to his Daisy and his W auto attack enhancement. He's actually really strong in laning phase, and he can catch a lot of people by surprise. So if you have a dual queue partner that plays one of these carry champions, highly recommend Ivern. Seraphine, she's more of a scaling supportive champion in that she's not that strong in laning phase, and she focuses on being very non-interactive by just wave clearing, but she scales into an absolute menace when she gets CDR around 2-3 items, and then she just carries game through shielding and a lot of AoE damage in fights. You could also argue that maybe she's a control mage, but I think she fits more in the supportive region. Soraka, strong laning phase as well, very obnoxious. She's probably the most supportive out of these champions in that She has a very good level 1 to 7 in the laning phase, level 1 to 9 even, but then during the mid game, she's a true support. She does not catch side lanes, she just sits with her team and she shields them and heals them. Well, she doesn't shield, but she heals her team. She does not carry minions, or she does not carry herself. She carries her team, and then her team carries her, right? She does not get side lane resources. So be aware of that if you play her. Zilean, probably my favorite supportive champion here. I played a bunch of Zilean. This champion is really good. People usually cannot punish him well enough in the laning phase. He's good with champions like Hecarim, champions like Xin Zhao, champions like Rengar, champions like Kindred, champions that really want movement speed and get on top of the enemy team, so Master Yi as well. And he's very hard to punish in the laning phase, especially at the lower end of the ladder. And his ult is just so annoying to play against if you're playing something like an assassin. So annoying. Highly recommend Zilean if you haven't tried him, but you want a supportive champion. Highly recommend him. Maybe you're more of a non-interactive mid laner. Maybe your hands don't work quite as well as they used to, they're a little bit decrepit, so you can't keep up mechanically in trades. So you want to play a champion that doesn't require you to be a 12-year-old kid cranking 90s on Fortnite, but still allows you to have an impact on the game overall. Well, let me present to you the push and roam tier. This is the biggest tier that we have on this list, mostly because a lot of mid lane champions fits this role, right? There are a lot of different styles even within this tier itself, which is very funny. Shows you the depth of mid lane styles, right? But Ahri, #1 champion. Why do I recommend this champion? Because it's my most played champion and I enjoy her a lot and I have a soft spot for her. Ahri, as a champion, has a lot of different styles, but the main way to play her is you just get level 7 and then you push and you roam out onto the map and you try to have an impact. I am going to release an Ahri guide. I've said this for the last few years, but I promise you it is coming. I am working on it. That goes into detail of how to play Ahri and how to navigate and get items on her properly. But she can play as an assassin, a setup champion, a control mage. She has a lot of different styles. That's why I recommend her. And she has a lot of depth to her. But the main way to play her, push, roam, and you don't have to be very skilled at her mechanically, right? She transitions into either a control mage, a DPS champion, or a setup champion or an assassin, right? That's what she transitions into, right? Malzahar, very easy mechanical champion, but at the end of the day, all he does is he pushes and he roams after he gets his last chapter. He transitions more into a control mage champion that can one-shot dive champions and has a lot of damage. So if you want to play a champion that can like kind of transition into more of a traditional damage champion, I'd highly recommend Malzahar if you like the control mage style, but you still aren't super confident in your mechanics, especially during team fights. Echo, probably one of the higher skill ceiling champions in this tier, mostly because of how he can play trades and navigate the laning phase, but at the end of the day, all he does is he pushes and he roams. Very difficult to navigate in fights during the mid game, especially on how to find angles on him. So unless you are a one-trick or you have a lot of experience playing other champions that play team fights like an assassin, I would not recommend picking up Echo. But he is probably one of the most fun champions in the game, I would say, but he's also very difficult. But again, at the end of the day, all you should be doing with this game is having fun, because that's going to make you play a lot more, which means you're going to improve a lot more. So at the end of the day, if you think he's fun, play him. But you just got to respect the fact that there's a lot of learning that goes into this champion. Gragas, very non-interactive laner. You take Comet, you press Q on the enemy laner, impossible to dodge because the barrel is the size of the Grand Canyon, or like the entire Atlantic Ocean for that matter. And then you just get your Comet proc on him. He has insane sustain in the laning phase. He's very hard to beat in lane. Very good if you're not super confident in your laning ability, because, well, it's very hard to lose lane on him. After you get your Rod of Ages, you just press Q on the wave and then you leave. He turns into more of a kind of frontline tanky champion in the mid game, so if you want a champion like that, absolutely pick him up. Same goes for Cho'Gath. I have a soft spot for Cho'Gath. I play a lot of Cho'Gath when I go for Challenger because people don't know how to play against him, but the way you play him is either you press Q on the enemy laner, and then if your Q hits, well, great, you've dealt 300 damage to them. Now you just need to hit one more and you can one-shot them with your ult. If you don't hit, well then just aim for the wave, blow up the wave if the enemy laner is too scared or playing too far back, or is just too good mechanically so you can't hit a Q on them, then you just hit the wave instead. Then you just blow up the wave and you just go kill the enemy bot lane. You don't have to interact with the enemy laner if you don't want to. You can just one-shot the wave. Your Q does so much damage anyway. And again, a lot of sustain due to his passive. And he scales into more of a frontline champion as well. I really like the AP Cho'Gath variant where you play Everfrost, Demonic Embrace, and then either you go into a tank setup where you have a bunch of damage due to Demonic Embrace, or you commit to a full AP build with Deathcap where you can just one-shot everyone. A lot of fun. Garen, very similar to Cho'Gath in the way that he is very hard to deal with in the laning phase. He will spin on you and he will go for one-shots on you. Very easy champion to play as well, and he transitions into more of a bruisery champion. This is very good if you want an AD champion in the mid lane, and if you like Beyblading and being a Beyblade, then Garen's great. You can also play very non-interactive on him. You can also choose to trade with the enemy laner. At the end of the day, it comes down to if the enemy laner walks up and tries to trade with you or contest the wave, trade with them. If the enemy laner stands underneath their tower, push the wave and go kill their jungler or their bot lane. Make it their problem. Like, the main thing about this tier is, like, you have multiple ways you can play. If the enemy laner tries to contest the wave, you can either choose to interact with them or you can choose to hit the wave. And if the enemy laner sits underneath their tower, you just choose to hit the wave and then you just leave. Make it the bot lane's problem. The thing about mid lane is, if you don't fight the enemy laner, it is not your problem, it is your bot lane's problem, right? Like, if I'm not getting priority against an Ahri or any of the champions in this list, it is not my problem. It's going to be my bot lane's problem because they're the ones getting dove by the Ahri. But I can sit under tower and do nothing and be 0-0-0, but my bot lane will be 0-20, right? And they will ult F4. That's the point of this tier, right? So be very aware that you should be looking for roams when you're playing champions in this tier. Talon, you could consider Talon an assassin. I think he's more of a push and roam champion. I don't think he's quite as good as an assassin anymore. I think the way you play Talon is you push the wave and then you try to explode out onto the map with your E and you try to get your teammates ahead because you cannot 1v9 games on your own as Talon anymore. It's just not possible after the nerfs. Twisted Fate, I have recently discovered the Ludens build on Twisted Fate, so I'm tempted to put him somewhere, but I think he fits in the push and roam tier because all you're doing on Twisted Fate is you're pushing the wave and then you're ulting down to the bot lane and you're trying to kill the enemy bot lane on repeat. That is all you're doing. And then you transition into more of a either supportive champion if you decide to go for the Everfrost Rapid Fire build, or more of a assassin champion or DPS champion in that regard if you decide to go Ludens. I personally recommend Ludens just because, well, like in solo queue, do you really want to rely on your team to deal the damage? Not really, right? You want to be the one dealing the damage to make sure you can carry the game. So go Ludens. Nuno and Singed, these are the champions that are very non-interactive in the laning phase, that are all about getting their teammates ahead. You cannot carry games on this champion or these champions if your teammates are not ahead. All you're doing is you're blowing up the wave, or you're dropping waves, and then you're running bot lane, or you're running into the enemy jungle, and you're trying to kill them. You need to get an advantage by getting your teammates ahead on this champion, because you're just letting the enemy team do, or the enemy mid laner do whatever they want, usually. But I would highly recommend these champions if you don't want to interact with the enemy mid laner at all, or if you enjoy playing more of an annoying style that feels like has no counterplay if you're laning against it. Because, like, what is the mid laner supposed to do when the Singe just leaves lane and runs bot lane and tries to kill them, right? But this is very good if you want to be super annoying, and can very easily be strong in solo queue because people usually don't respect your roams as much. Now, this is the real tier. This is the tier that we've all been waiting for. This is the tier that can just absolutely 1v9 games on their own. They do not need to rely on teammates. They do not need to rely on junglers. They do not need to rely on AD carries. Why? Because they bring the damage themselves. These champions are all about finding resources on the map and then 1v9ing the game with sheer damage and possibility in that regard, sheer DPS and sheer threat in teamfights. The main goal on these champions is always going to be collect as many resources as possible and be as efficient as possible, right? Like, try to play around 10 CS when you play these champions. All of these champions from Azir to Karthus need to be on around 10 CS per minute. They need to accelerate with gold, and then once you hit 3 items, you can 1v9 games with sheer damage, right? So let's start with Azir. What you'll notice is most of these champions, if not all of them, has incredibly high DPS. Azir is no different. His soldiers, incredible DPS. Very good if you enjoy playing control mages. He is one of the hardest champions in the game, so be aware of that because you have to manage your soldiers. He's probably the truest DPS control mage we have in the game, maybe next to something like a Cassiopeia. But this champion is bonkers. He can push very well during the laning phase with his W because you can constantly auto-attack the wave. He has the possibility to play proactively with his ult, right? You can shuffle the enemy team into you, but the truest way he plays is as a DPS champion, shredding the enemy frontline and just carrying the entire game himself. That is what you'll notice with these champions. They can all carry games on their own, which is why I usually recommend these champions to people that are like, how am I supposed to win games in solo queue? It feels like my teammates are griefing me. Yeah, take matters into your own hands. I don't care if your bot lane is 0-10. These champions can still carry the game with sheer damage. Kassadin. Oh my god, do I love Kassadin. This champion is the champ I play whenever I want to get an insane win rate whenever I smurf to master tier. Mostly because you can absolutely 1v9 games if you know how to collect waves properly on this guy. Play 10 CS per minute, get level 16. It doesn't matter if your entire team is losing. Once you hit 16 on Kassadin, if you have collected waves sufficiently, boom, you can 1v9 games just like that. The amount of ults you can get off in a fight, absolutely bonkers. You carry games through just collecting resources, hitting that level 16, and then having that insane low ult cooldown. You just one-shot the entire enemy team during fights. make sure the way you play Kassadin is don't be scared, be willing to actually jump in. You can play fights quite slowly. The way you usually want to play is alt in, use your combo, and then run away, and then alt back in again. Or make sure to also maneuver around angles. You want to come from Fog of War when you play this guy. This is the only champion on the list that is closer to an assassin, but I think he is probably the champion in the game that can 1v9 the best because you have proactive tools on him as well. Unlike all of these other champions that are kind of reliant on your teammates starting fights, but can 1v9 the fights themselves once the fight has started, right? Vladimir scales very well. Play 10 CS per minute on him. Go watch Elite 500 and how he combos. Learn all the combos of Vladimir, and you should be set for life. He's very obnoxious and very annoying to push out a laning phase. The problem with him right now is most champions in the meta right now are control mages. Vladimir sucks against control mages, but if you like healing up and getting into a battle of attrition with the enemy laners where you run them out of mana and then eventually kill them, I'd highly recommend this champion. Tristana, very good if you like blasting towers, and very good against a lot of champions on this list, especially Kassadin, because, well, she's full AD and you can push him under tower, and she scales very well into a DPS AD carry, right? AD carries all scale very well. They are all hyper carries in the traditional sense, so Tristana is no different. It's something like if you play Tristana bot lane, she also is a hyper carry, right? Same thing mid lane, except mid lane, you can collect more levels on her, which means you can get more range on her due to her passive, and you can also take more resources because you can usually push enemies out of lane and then one-shot towers. She's actually really strong in lane, and she's a hyper carry that can 1v9 games. It's perfect, right? Be aware that she kind of sucks into some control mages though, because she has quite low range during the early stages, and you probably have to play for more all-ins in that regard. Aurelion Sol, probably the champion I recommend the most for lower MMRs, mostly because you can just farm and then win the game. Be very aware when you play Aurelion Sol. I had my roommate playing Aurelion Sol earlier, and he was like, yeah, so the first 2 games I actually did nothing, just farmed, and I won the games very easily. And then the 3rd game I decided to try to fist fight, and I lost the game instantly. Don't fight on Aurelion Sol. You are so weak early game, but I promise you, even if your entire team is losing, if you can make it to 2 items, you will win the game instantly. Once you get your Rylai's, you can start actually fighting, you can start trying to take control over the game, but till then, I promise you, you are a caster minion. Do not try to make proactive things happen on Aurelion Sol early game. Please don't. He can't do it. He sucks too much early, but he scales, and he's very difficult to punish early game, especially when you're playing at the lower end of the ladder, because people don't know how to deal with the fact that he can just spit on the wave and one-shot it. But don't try to follow roams unless you are very confident that it's going to work. Karthus, you might be a little bit surprised to see him, but I think Karthus is a traditional 1v9 champion. You just need to collect a lot of gold on him. He's very strong in the laning phase. Figure out if you need to build Ludens or Liandry's. Ludens is generally speaking good against squishier team compositions where fights are going to be played very quickly. Liandry's are good if you need more DPS or if you're trying to shred tanks or the enemy team has a lot of bruisers and fights are going to be a bit slower. But you can take Exhaust, you can take Teleport on him, and you can try to play very aggressively for the laning phase if you're good at hitting Qs. If you're scripting, this champion is probably the best champion to play in the mid lane. I'd highly recommend him. Actually try to pick him up if you enjoy playing a champion that can both dominate the laning phase and scale very, very well, or decide to play for more wave clear if you just want to queue the wave instead. I highly recommend Karthus. I think more people should play Karthus. The last tier here is a little bit of a mishmash. These are champions I just call win lane because they require you to win lane to actually be useful. These are champions if you enjoy absolutely smashing the opponent in the laning phase and then exploding out onto the map. They win almost any matchup you pick them into if you're competent at them, and they can carry games through getting ahead in the laning phase and then roaming out onto the map, right? They have a lot of different styles. Akshan, for example, he plays more as an assassin or a DPS champion during team fights. He can kind of switch between the two of them, which is very cool because very few champions can do that. And he wins basically every laning phase you play him because, well, he's just that strong with his passive, right? You have 2 auto attacks and you get a shield. Like, how broken is that? Absolutely recommend him if you do enjoy crushing laning phase. Rumble turns into more of an AoE teamfighting champion, but can usually win laning phases just due to the fact that he has a massive shield on his W, and his Q DPS is absolutely insane. He just has insane base stats early game, so pick him if you enjoy playing a champion that is strong in laning phase and then transitions into more of a teamfighting champion, right? Heimerdinger, push lane, anti-dive. Good. Hard to deal with, unless you're a control mage. Lucian, sucks at the moment, but an AD carry that can also stomp laning phase, but not really right now because he's so weak and he's not really meant to be played mid lane due to his passive. Irelia, diving champion that wins laning phase if you're good mechanically. If your name is Irelia King, absolutely play this champion. She kind of sucks in team fights, especially if you don't know how to navigate her or you play against a lot of CC. But If you want to, you can just side lane and call it a day. Once you get your Blade of the Rune King, you are full item. You can one-shot anyone. It doesn't matter if you die 3 times in the lane. You still win the laning phase once you complete your Borg. And she usually is required to get ganked a lot by the enemy jungler to be able to fully shut her down in the game. So be aware of that. Be aware that you don't become the Irelia that goes 0-18 in the laning phase and then blames her jungler because she got camped by the enemy jungler because she played too aggressively and tried to dive the enemy laner 18 times on the tower, right? Don't do that. Just push the wave and then roam bot lane. Win the game. But yeah, let me know if you guys disagree with this list. Let me know if you have any comments, if I forgot any champions, or if you think champions should be going into different tiers. Like I said at the start of the video, all of these champions can go into different tiers. They're multifaceted. That's the thing about mid laners. They have very many different styles. And also, if you did enjoy, please subscribe to the channel. I appreciate it. And have a good one. See you. Bye-bye.